The prison air was thick with the scent of sweat and steel, a place where hope came to die. Officer Brad leaned lazily against the bars of a dimly lit cell, arms crossed, a smug grin stretched across his face. His cold blue eyes scanned the man sitting silently on the hard cot, a black prisoner in an orange jumpsuit, his hands resting on his knees. Brad let out a chuckle, loud enough for the other officers standing nearby to hear. "You know," he drawled, his voice dripping with arrogance, "people like you don't belong anywhere else but in cages. It's just the way things are. You're born, you mess up, and then you rot in a place like this. It's a cycle, ain't it?" The other officers chuckled, nodding in agreement. Darnell didn't flinch. His face remained still, unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something Brad couldn't quite put his finger on. Not fear, not anger, something else. Brad took a step forward, his heavy boots echoing on the cold concrete floor. He bent down, lowering his face to Darnell's level. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" He smirked, tapping the metal bars with his baton. "Come on, say something. Or are you too dumb to even speak?" Silence. Darnell's jaw clenched, but he didn't react. He didn't give Brad the satisfaction. The silence irritated Brad. He grabbed Darnell's collar and yanked him up, slamming him against the bars with a loud clang. The other inmates in the row stirred, but none dared to interfere. "You listening now, boy?" Brad sneered, his voice laced with venom. "You think you're special? You ain't nothing. You're just another worthless thug who thought he could outsmart the system. But look at you now." Darnell met Brad's gaze, his breathing steady. He still didn't say a word. Brad hated it. He hated that look. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't defeat. It was something dangerous. "Bet you thought you were too smart to end up here," Brad continued, pushing Darnell harder against the bars. "Bet you thought the world owed you something." He turned to his fellow officers and laughed. "I love these types, always thinking they got a way out, always believing in some damn dream. Newsflash, there ain't no dream, just this." He pressed his baton against Darnell's ribs and pushed hard. Darnell grunted but didn't break. Brad's laughter filled the corridor, joined by the other officers. It was the sound of unchecked power, of men who had been allowed to play gods in a system built on cruelty. "You're nothing," Brad whispered close to Darnell's ear, his breath hot against his skin. "And you'll die nothing." For the first time, Darnell moved, a slow, deliberate turn of his head, eyes locking onto Brad's. And he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a forced one, a calm, knowing smile. Brad's laughter faltered for just a second. Something about that look sent a chill down his spine. He didn't know it yet. But this would be the last time he ever looked down on Darnell. The echoes of Brad's laughter still lingered in the dimly lit corridor as he stepped back, adjusting his uniform like he had just won some meaningless battle. He didn't know why, but something about Darnell's silence, that damn smile, made his skin crawl. He had seen hundreds of prisoners break in front of him. Some begged, some fought, some crumbled into nothing. But this one wasn't reacting the way he should. Brad clenched his jaw and turned to one of the younger officers standing nearby. "You know his story." He jerked a thumb at Darnell. "Or is he just another thug from the assembly line?" The young officer, Wilson, hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, I read his file. Used to be a teacher. Real smart guy, apparently. No record, no priors." Brad scoffed. "Yeah? And what, he just accidentally ended up in a max security prison?" He shook his head, chuckling. "I swear they all got the same damn excuse." Wilson shifted uncomfortably, but didn't reply. He had only been at the prison for a few months, still learning how things really worked. Brad turned back to the cell, his grin widening as he banged the bars with his baton. "That true, Professor? You were a teacher?" Darnell didn't answer, but his eyes darkened for a fraction of a second. Brad noticed, and it only made him push further. Come on, entertain me, Brad taunted. What was it? History? English? Or did you just teach little thugs like yourself how to survive the streets? Darnell exhaled slowly, still not speaking. Brad rolled his eyes. Fine, I'll tell the story then. He leaned against the bars like he was about to share a campfire tale. Let me guess. You were a good guy once, huh? Worked hard, followed the rules, believed in justice and all that crap. But then, he snapped his fingers. Boom! One mistake, one bad choice, and suddenly the system ain't on your side anymore. Darnell finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. I never made a mistake. Brad smirked. Yeah? Then why are you here? Darnell's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. Because he knew why. The courtroom smelled of old wood and stale air, filled with murmurs of a case that should have never gone this far. Darnell sat at the defendant's table, his hands gripping the polished surface. Across the room, the jury sat in uncomfortable silence, their eyes darting between him and the judge who was about to decide his fate. Judge Hammond, a man whose name carried weight in the state, tough on crime, no sympathy, and notorious for handing out the harshest sentences to black defendants. Darnell had been wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit, a robbery turned violent in a neighborhood he hadn't even been near. No physical evidence, no fingerprints, no surveillance footage linking him to the scene. Just one witness, a white store clerk who claimed he looked like the guy. That was all it took. His lawyer had argued, pleaded, laid out the facts. But Judge Hammond barely listened. He leaned forward, his expression blank. The evidence is circumstantial, he admitted, pausing just long enough for the courtroom to feel the weight of false hope. Then he turned to the jury. But given the history of the defendant's community and the nature of this crime, I believe it is in the best interest of justice to issue the maximum sentence allowed by law. Darnell's heart stopped. His mother gasped behind him, gripping the bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. His lawyer stood, outraged. Your Honor, with all due respect, sentence is final. And just like that, his life was stolen from him. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a violent man. He wasn't what they painted him to be. But none of that mattered. The system had decided. And now, he was just another prisoner. Brad snapped his fingers in front of Darnell's face. You still with me? He teased. What's wrong? Thinking about what you did? Darnell finally looked up, his gaze sharp. I didn't do anything. Brad let out a low whistle. That's what they all say. Wilson shifted again, uncomfortable. Actually, sir, I looked deeper into his file. It's kind of messed up. No real evidence. The judge handling the case has a history of... Brad slammed his baton against the bars. Shut it. Wilson flinched. Brad leaned closer to Darnell. Let me tell you something, Professor, he muttered. In here, it doesn't matter what you did or didn't do. You think this place gives a damn about fairness, about truth. He smirked. No, you're exactly where you belong. Darnell didn't reply, because in that moment, something clicked. He had spent months thinking that maybe there was still some fairness left in the world, that maybe if he stayed quiet, stayed patient, someone would see the truth. But looking at Brad's smug face, he realized something. They weren't going to give him justice. He was going to take it. And none of them saw it coming. The prison cafeteria was a dull, colorless room, buzzing with the low murmurs of men who had accepted their fate. Metal trays scraped against old wooden tables. Guards stood along the walls, arms crossed, their eyes sharp like vultures waiting for something to go wrong. Darnell sat at the corner table, his tray untouched. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the table, an old habit from his teaching days when he used to drum his fingers on the desk while grading papers. But today, it wasn't a habit. It was a calculation. Yo, Professor! A voice broke through his thoughts. Darnell looked up to see Marcus, a fellow inmate, sliding onto the bench across from him. Marcus was one of the few prisoners who didn't avoid him. He was young, barely in his 20s, locked up for a crime he never had a chance to fight against. "You all right?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Darnell exhaled. "Just thinking." Marcus smirked. "Thinking don't do much in here, man. Action does." Darnell glanced around the room. Exactly. Marcus frowned, sensing something different in his tone. Before he could ask, a heavy shadow fell over them. Brad. And he wasn't alone. 2 other guards stood beside him, their expressions blank, but their eyes filled with quiet amusement. Brad was grinning like a man about to have some fun. "Well, well, look at this," he drawled, tapping his baton against Darnell's tray. "Professor finally making friends?" Darnell didn't respond. Brad's smile widened. "See, I was just passing by when I realized you haven't eaten." He picked up a carton of milk from Darnell's tray, examining it like it was made of gold. "A man's gotta eat. You know that, right?" Silence. Brad's eyes flickered with irritation. He hated when prisoners didn't play along. Then, without warning, he squeezed the carton, sending a stream of milk splashing onto Darnell's face. The cafeteria fell silent. Darnell didn't move. Milk dripped from his chin onto the table, mixing with the uneaten food. His hands clenched into fists under the table, but he didn't react. Brad chuckled, looking back at the other guards. "See, boys? This one's well trained." The guards laughed. Marcus, tense beside Darnell, whispered, "Man, don't." Brad leaned in close. "What's wrong, Professor? Ain't got nothing to say?" Darnell stared at him, his jaw tight, his fury barely restrained. Brad smirked, tapping the baton against the table. "Tell you what, since I'm feeling generous today—" He pointed to the ground. "Clean that up." Darnell's breath slowed. "Come on now," Brad taunted. "Be a good boy and wipe it up." Darnell didn't move. The air grew thick with tension, and for the first time Brad's smile faltered. Something about Darnell's eyes, the way they bore into him, not with fear, not with defeat, but with something else, it made his skin crawl. A moment passed. Then Brad's expression hardened. "Fine," he muttered. In one brutal motion, he grabbed Darnell's tray and slammed it into his chest, knocking him backward off the bench. Food splattered onto the floor as inmates gasped, some standing up, some looking away. Guards rushed forward, grabbing Darnell before he could react, pinning his arms behind his back. Brad crouched beside him. "Now you get to see how things really work around here." The cell was pitch black. No windows, no bed, just concrete walls that swallowed the air. Darnell sat on the floor, his back against the cold surface, his breathing steady but slow. This wasn't just punishment. This was a message. He had spent the last 5 hours in darkness, no sound, no sense of time. But Brad wasn't done yet. The door creaked open, and the blinding light from the hallway cut through the darkness. Brad stepped inside, his silhouette towering over Darnell. "I've seen men break in this room," he said, his voice low, almost casual. "Grown men, killers, tough guys." He took a step closer. "You know what they all have in common?" Darnell said nothing. Brad crouched in front of him. "They all thought they were different." Silence. Brad sighed, shaking his head. "You're no different, Professor." Darnell finally spoke, his voice calm. "You talk a lot." Brad's smirk returned. "That's funny. I was about to say the same about you." He stood up, dusting off his uniform. "See, I get it. You think you're special. Think you're better than the rest of them." He turned to leave. Then, at the last second, he glanced back. "You're not." The door slammed shut, leaving Darnell alone in darkness again. But this time, Darnell wasn't just sitting there. His fingers traced the small, sharp edge of something cold hidden in his sleeve. Brad thought he had broken him. But what he didn't realize, Darnell had just made a decision. And this time, he wasn't going to wait for justice. The air in the prison yard was thick with sweat and tension. Inmates stood in clusters, their conversations low and cautious. The guards patrolled lazily, their hands resting on their batons, their gazes sharp. Darnell sat on a worn-out bench, his eyes scanning the yard, not for escape, not for violence, but for opportunity. His ribs still ached from the last beating. His pride had taken a hit, but his mind was sharper than ever. Across the yard, Brad leaned against the fence, laughing with another officer. His eyes flicked to Darnell occasionally, like a cat watching a wounded mouse. But what Brad didn't realize was, this mouse had teeth. You keep staring at him like that, he's going to kill you in your sleep. Darnell turned to see Luis, a middle-aged inmate with tattoos covering his arms and a permanent smirk on his face. Luis had been locked up for over a decade, and somehow he had survived. "What do you want?" Darnell asked, his voice calm. Luis chuckled. "You, my friend, are either real smart or real stupid." Darnell didn't respond. Luis sat beside him. "I've seen guys like you before, thinking they can fight the system with their brains." He tilted his head toward Brad. "That man? He don't play by rules. He don't care if you're innocent, smart, or some kind of genius. You push him, he pushes back. Harder." Darnell exhaled, keeping his gaze on the ground. "And yet, you're still here." Luis grinned. "Exactly." A beat passed. Then Luis leaned in slightly. "But see, Brad's got a weakness, every man does." Darnell finally looked at him. "And what's his?" Luis smirked. "His ego." Darnell knew Brad thrived on control, on fear, on dominance. But what happened when someone refused to give him that? That evening in the cafeteria, Brad made his way down the rows of tables, his presence alone enough to make inmates shrink back. He stopped behind Darnell, towering over him. "You eat like a man who's lost his appetite," Brad said, smirking. Darnell picked up his spoon, took a slow bite, and smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to be noticed. Brad's smirk faltered. "Something funny?" Darnell shrugged. "Just thinking." Brad narrowed his eyes. "Yeah? About what?" Darnell put his spoon down, locking eyes with him. How weak men hide behind power. The cafeteria went dead silent. A few inmates looked up, their eyes darting between Darnell and Brad. No one ever talked back to a guard like that, especially not Brad. Brad's jaw tensed. "You got something to say, Professor?" Darnell leaned back, his voice calm, measured. "You ever notice how real power doesn't need to be proven? But a man like you always feels the need to remind everyone who's in charge." A few inmates exchanged glances. Some even smirked. Brad's face darkened. And just like that, Darnell had won the first move. Later that night, Brad was still fuming. No prisoner had ever made him feel that way before. He needed to put Darnell in his place, now. So he did what he always did. He set him up. During a routine cell check, Brad planted a shank under Darnell's mattress. Then, with a dramatic flourish, he pulled it out in front of two other guards. "Well, well," Brad announced, "looks like our little professor isn't so innocent after all." The other guards looked at each other, unsure. Darnell, however, didn't flinch. "Shakedown protocol," Brad said smugly. "That's an extra 6 months on your sentence." Darnell simply smiled. That smile made Brad hesitate. Then the warden's voice boomed from the hallway. "What's going on here?" Warden Mitchell, the only man in the prison who had more power than Brad. Brad straightened. "Sir, we found this in his cell." He held up the shank. The warden's sharp eyes landed on Darnell. "You have something to say?" Darnell took a breath. Now was his moment. "Sir, I would like to request a review of the security footage," he said, his voice loud enough for the nearby guards and inmates to hear. Brad froze. The warden narrowed his eyes. "What?" Darnell kept his expression blank. If the search was random, then surely the cameras would show whether that weapon was always there, or if someone placed it there. A ripple of whispers spread through the inmates. Even the guards shifted uncomfortably. Brad knew the cameras in the cells weren't working. They hadn't been for weeks. But Darnell also knew that Brad knew. The warden folded his arms. "Brad?" Brad cleared his throat. "Sir, we don't have time to review every little—" "Then how can you be sure it was his?" Darnell interrupted smoothly. The warden sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He hated dealing with unnecessary paperwork. After a pause, he looked at Brad. "Unless you have undeniable proof, I suggest you drop it." Brad's fist clenched, his jaw tight. "Sir, I said, drop it." And just like that, Brad had lost. The tension in the room shifted. Darnell had won. Not a big victory, not freedom, but a moment, a tiny crack in Brad's control. And everyone in the prison had seen it. For the first time, Brad looked weak. As the warden walked away, the guards hesitated before following. But Brad stayed behind, staring at Darnell with an expression that was no longer amusement. It was hatred. Darnell knew what that meant. Brad wouldn't forget this. And the next time, he wouldn't play fair. The moment the warden walked away, his mask of authority slipped, revealing pure, unfiltered rage. Darnell had made a fool of him, in front of everyone. That night, as the prison lights dimmed and inmates settled in, Brad was already planning his revenge. And this time, he wouldn't just break Darnell's body. He would break his soul. The next morning, during roll call, Darnell felt the shift in the air. The way the guards looked at him, the way some of the inmates avoided his gaze, something was coming. And then it happened. "Cell 304, step forward." Darnell raised his head as two guards marched toward him. Not Brad, different ones. His stomach clenched. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Darnell hesitated. He had learned one thing in prison. When guards other than your usual tormentors came for you, it was never good. But resisting would make it worse. He slowly complied, and they cuffed him. Then, as they led him down the hallway, he finally saw Brad, leaning against the wall, smirking. Darnell didn't say a word. He just stared. Brad gave him a small nod, as if to say, "Checkmate." Darnell was not taken to solitary. He wasn't taken to the warden's office. Instead, he was led to a dark, isolated block of the prison. The hole. This wasn't just solitary confinement. This was where they threw the worst of the worst, the kind of prisoners who had nothing to lose. And Darnell wasn't supposed to be here. The guards shoved him into a cell already occupied by two men. Men who had spent years in this darkness. Men who had no reason to follow rules. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, Darnell knew what Brad had done. He hadn't just put him here. He had put him here to die. It started the moment the guards walked away. The two men, hulking figures covered in scars, smiled. "You must be real special to get dumped in here," one of them sneered, cracking his knuckles. Darnell didn't react. Because fear? Fear was exactly what Brad wanted. But that didn't stop the first punch from landing, or the second, or the third. Darnell hit the floor hard, his ribs screaming in pain, his vision blurred. One of the men grabbed him by the collar. "You don't belong here, pretty boy." Another punch, harder. Blood dripped from Darnell's lip. And yet, he grinned. The men paused. Darnell coughed, spitting blood to the side. "You know," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Brad must really be scared of me if he's sending guys like you to do his dirty work." The atmosphere shifted. The two men stopped. Darnell wiped his lip. "Tell me, how much did he pay you?" Silence. He had them. Because if there was one thing criminals hated more than prison, it was being used. And Darnell had just planted a seed. Hours passed, maybe days. There was no way to tell time in the hole. Darnell's body screamed in pain, but his mind, it was working. Then something happened. One of the men, the same one who had beaten him, sat beside him and spoke. "You're different." Darnell stayed silent. The man continued. "We've heard whispers about you." He glanced at the cell door as if expecting someone to be listening. "Word is, you weren't just some regular guy on the outside." Darnell's breath hitched. The man leaned in. "They say you had connections, real ones, that you had power." Darnell didn't confirm or deny. He simply stared, because that was the game. The whispers, the hints, the doubt creeping into people's minds. Who really was Darnell? And for the first time, the question wasn't just in his head. It was in theirs. Meanwhile, Brad was celebrating. Darnell had been thrown into a pit of monsters. He had no way out. Or so he thought. Because what Brad failed to realize was that monsters, they respect other monsters. And when Darnell finally walked out of the hole, he wasn't alone. He had allies. And Brad had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The prison was buzzing. A new warden was coming. The news spread fast, guards whispering, inmates speculating. And Brad? He was thrilled. The old warden had been weak, always worried about human rights and fairness. But now, with the right man in charge, Brad could finally run things the way he wanted. He stood tall, fixing his uniform in the mirror. His reign was just beginning. Or so he thought. The entire prison was gathered in the yard. Guards stood in formation, prisoners lined up, murmuring among themselves. Then silence. The deputy warden stepped forward, clearing his throat. "As of today, we welcome a new leader to this facility." Brad folded his arms, smirking. Then the words that followed changed everything. "Introducing Warden Darnell Carter." The world stopped. Brad's heart slammed against his ribs. His vision blurred. No, this wasn't possible. And yet there he was, stepping onto the stage, dressed in a pristine black warden's uniform. Darnell, alive, free, powerful, and staring straight at Brad. A single bead of sweat slid down Brad's neck. His mind screamed for an answer, a reason, an explanation. But Darnell? He just smiled, calm, controlled, and completely in charge. Brad took a step back, his breathing unsteady. This wasn't real. He turned to the other guards, but they weren't laughing. They weren't sneering. They were watching, waiting. Because suddenly the power in this prison had shifted. Brad was no longer the man in control. Darnell was. And Brad knew exactly what was coming next. Darnell's voice rang through the yard. "Some of you know me," he said, pacing slowly. "Some of you think you know me." His eyes locked onto Brad. The color drained from Brad's face. "During my time here, I saw things. I learned things. I learned about a system that thrives on corruption, on cruelty, on men who believe power makes them untouchable." He let those words sink in. The prisoners watched. The guards listened. Darnell exhaled slowly. "That ends today." Brad's stomach twisted. Then Darnell spoke again. 4 words that shattered everything. "Officer Brad, step forward." Brad's feet refused to move. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something, but he was trapped. Darnell tilted his head. No? He glanced at the deputy warden. Bring him. 2 officers grabbed Brad. Not inmates, guards, his own men. The betrayal hit like a punch to the gut. He struggled, kicked, shouted, but it was useless. They dragged him forward, forcing him to his knees in front of Darnell. The yard was dead silent. Darnell crouched, looking Brad in the eye. "You enjoyed this position, didn't you?" he murmured. "Being the one in charge, holding the power." Brad's breathing was ragged. "This prison was your kingdom," Darnell continued, "but you forgot one thing about being a king." He leaned in. "When the people turn against you, you fall." And then the final blow. Darnell pulled a folder from his pocket. A thick government-sealed folder. And when he opened it, Brad's soul left his body. Because inside, every crime he ever committed, every abuse, every illegal act, every cover-up, all documented, all exposed. Darnell's smile was razor-sharp. "Effective immediately," he said, "Officer Bradley Shaw is removed from duty." The yard erupted. Inmates cheered. Guards whispered. Brad begged. He swore, he pleaded, he screamed, but it didn't matter, because his reign was over. And Darnell? He had won. The walls of the prison, once Brad's personal empire, now felt suffocating. His uniform was ripped away, his badge gone. The same guards who once obeyed his every command now escorted him like a criminal. And the inmates? They watched, silent, smirking, waiting. Brad's breath hitched, his throat tightened, because he knew. He was about to experience the same fear, the same helplessness that he had inflicted on so many others. The iron bars slammed shut. Brad flinched. The guard locking the door? One of his own men. The ultimate betrayal. He turned, only to see Darnell standing outside the cell. Calm, composed, in control. Brad lost control. "You set me up," he roared, gripping the bars. "This isn't fair." Darnell raised an eyebrow. "Fair?" His voice was ice. "You want to talk about fair?" Brad's chest heaved. His world was crumbling. "You destroyed lives," Darnell continued. "You laughed while people suffered. You played God." Brad's hands trembled. "You put people in here who never belonged." Darnell stepped closer. "And now? It's your turn." Brad shook his head violently. No, you can't do this to me." Darnell exhaled. Then he said something Brad would never forget. "I'm not doing anything to you." He gestured around. "This is just justice." Brad felt sick. He wanted to scream, to fight, to undo everything. But it was too late. The system he once controlled had swallowed him whole, and no one was coming to save him. As the prison gate shut behind him, Darnell took a deep breath. He should have felt satisfied, but something in his chest still felt heavy. This wasn't just about one man. This was about a system that had ruined people like him. A system that was still out there, waiting to claim another innocent life. His grip tightened. This wasn't over. Not yet. The prison was behind him now. But the real war? It was just beginning. As Darnell stepped into the world as a free man, a car pulled up. The door opened, a government official inside. "Darnell Carter," the man said. "The system needs men like you." Darnell's jaw clenched. "Are you ready to take it all down?" The camera fades to black.